The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Sam Berger of the Center for American Progress draws the parallels between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump and asks us to take a lesson from how the nation recovered from Watergate. Karen Hobert Flynn, the president of Common Cause, explains why a national popular vote is a better way to pick the next president. And Bill Press talks with Ironworkers General President Eric Dean. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In the wake of Watergate, a wave of reforms were ushered in to repair a dysfunctional government and regain the public's trust in its leaders. Sam Berger is a policy analyst who says that moment in history has much to offer in the modern day. And we say hello to Sam Berger, senior advisor at the Center for American Progress, where he recently posted a report co-authored with Alex Tasanovich titled Lessons from Watergate, Preparing for Post-Trump Reform. Sam Berger, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Your report begins with a simple observation that many have compared the Trump administration to the presidency of Richard Nixon, and you agree the similarities are striking. Where do you see the resonance between these two presidents?
Well, I think with both of these presidents, you see a willingness to tap into the darker currents of the American political climate. You see a disregard for the rule of law, and you see an overriding concern with settling political scores and damaging perceived enemies. And I think the thing that's most important about both of these presidents, you hear this phrase, a culture of corruption. And I think people sort of think of that just meaning, oh, that's a lot of corruption. But it's actually more than that. It means that, when you have a corrupt president at the top, you then have this sort of notion that corruption is okay, corruption is the norm, corruption is something that should even be encouraged, permeate throughout a whole administration. You have a president who's dishonest and unethical, who puts a premium on personal loyalty. That's the kind of person who's then going to hire people in the administration who are dishonest and unethical, right? People are going to be rewarded when they choose to look the other way or even aid in the sort of corruption. And people that basically call out the problems when they see them, that try and provide transparency, those people aren't going to advance. Those people are even going to be removed from the administration. And so over time, you get more and more corruption, and it starts to spread. And then you see, lower officials basically mimicking their boss. Scott Pruitt is a perfect example of that. And so this is something that we saw with Nixon. It's something that we're seeing with Trump, and it's incredibly concerning, and it's incredibly corrosive to our system.
Yeah, and way too eerily familiar. The purpose of the report is to bring into relief the way the nation responded to Watergate and suggests these responses provide a blueprint on how we may recover from the Trump administration. You begin with the concept of government transparency. Remind us how President Nixon was able to avoid transparency.
Sure. Well, one of the big issues was just that we didn't have a lot of the laws that I hope we have a chance to discuss later on today that came out of the post-Watergate era. So there just wasn't as much transparency. So you had secret campaign contributions from corporations. You had slush funds that those same corporations were using to bribe officials overseas. You had Nixon's own efforts to prevent Congress and the American people from seeing government records that would reveal the corrupt and in some cases criminal activity that he was engaged in. So part of what you see in the post-Watergate era is an effort to be clearer about what has to be revealed, requiring this transparency, in some cases, taking norms and making them into rules. And with any corrupt president, their corruption reveals holes in the system. And then you need to basically respond to those holes to fill them, to try and improve the system, to limit the ability of a future president to act in that same corrupt manner.
And Sam, what were some of the actions taken after Watergate to restore transparency in government?
So there's a wide range of them, but just to pick out a few, you had the Presidential Records Act. So prior to the passage of this law, the presidential papers were viewed as being the property of the president. They could take them with them, destroy them if they wanted to. There was very serious concerns with Nixon that he was going to do just that, destroy his records in order to hide from the American people what he had done, what other members of administration has done. So the Presidential Records Act put forward a pretty common sense notion. The records of the president, who we all hire to do this job, belong to the public, don't belong to the president. And it creates a system for preserving them and eventually releasing them. Then you had FOIA reform. FOIA is incredible. This is Freedom of Information Act. This is an incredibly powerful tool for finding out what the government's doing, what it's saying, making sure that there's transparency and responsiveness to the people. Problem was that FOIA, as it stood, didn't have enough teeth. Basically, people would, the government would continually claim national security or other sorts of concerns and keep documents from folks. And what these reforms did was close that loophole, made clear that you can't say that something is a national security issue, basically, unless it's really a national security issue. It got judges to determine whether or not information was properly classified, so that this sort of process of overly classifying to hide embarrassing material rather than material that needed to be kept hidden because of its national security implications. And then you had the IG Act. This basically put people within each agency whose job it was to root out corruption and misuse of taxpayer dollars. These were folks that didn't report up the normal chain of command and had an incentive to basically hold agencies accountable. This is a huge issue, or rather a huge step taken. And in fact, many of the scandals that have been revealed in time since come from IG reports because they're close to these issues, they're dogged, and because of the structure that's created, they're basically not political appointees aren't able to tamp these down or get rid of the investigations.
Mm-hmm. Ethics, another important concept you address. We may not have to be reminded of President Nixon's ethical abuses, but again, how did government respond in the post-Nixon era?
Sure. So one big one was the Ethics in Government Act, the aptly named Ethics in Government Act. This created widespread transparency requirements, including mandatory financial disclosure for members of Congress, candidates, some high-level executive branch officials. It created the Office of Government Ethics, which is the first centralized overseer of executive branch ethics requirements. And it adopted into law some of the congressional ethics rules that had been put in place around things like limits on lobbying by former members. And then you have civil service reform. There was major civil service reform that occurred in the late 70s. And that also, one of the issues that we saw under Nixon was misuse of the government bureaucracy. This tried to insulate civil servants to a certain extent from the political process. It created an organized appeal process for adverse personnel actions. It set out a new system for performance-based pay and promotion, and it strengthened protections for whistleblowers against reprisal for revealing government misconduct. So those are some of the ways to bring ethics back into reassert the important role of ethics in government.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Sam Berger, the senior advisor at the Center for American Progress, where he recently posted a report co-authored with Alex Tasanovich titled Lessons from Watergate, Preparing for Post-Trump Reforms. Nixon, Sam, is also known for flying in the face of ethical campaign funding with secret campaign slush funds, illegal corporate contributions, a possible quid pro quo agreement with ITT. What changes occurred there as a result?
Sure. So the biggest one was in the area of campaign finance reform. And you see that just an enormous change in how we regulate campaigns. So you had the creation of the Federal Election Committee to overseeing a body to basically oversee the rules and make sure that people were following them. You saw the introduction of comprehensive limits on contributions to and expenditures by political campaigns. This is really the backbone of what we think of today as the campaign finance system, of the rules of the system. Another major change was the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So one of the things that they discovered when they were looking into some of these questionable donations that were made to the Nixon campaign by corporations was that they were made from the same slush funds that these corporations were using to bribe officials overseas. And the issue became, well, it wasn't entirely clear exactly whether or not this was legal. And so the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act made it clear you couldn't bribe foreign officials overseas, and it imposed accounting standards on U.S. companies to make sure that they would accurately record their transactions. We'd be able to keep track of whether or not they were violating the law. So those are sort of the two big ones.
We really had to learn a lot in a short amount of time. You also address abuse of power, because why stop with ethics and campaign funding? Not only by the government and by Nixon himself, the way he used his presidential power, and as you said before, it starts at the top. These abuses led to significant changes. What are some of the most important there?
Yeah, so one of the things that Nixon did was, so the government has access to vast amounts of information, and he tried to get his hands on that information in order to attack his political enemies. And so you saw this effort to try and limit the ways in which the government could misuse information. So a huge one is the Privacy Act, which deals with what the government can and can't do with the personal information it collects on all of us. This is basically the backbone of how we understand privacy protections in the government today. You have the Tax Reform Act, which made sure that IRS information, very sensitive information around people's taxes, can only be disclosed in very limited specific circumstances, so that couldn't be abused or used to embarrass or threaten political enemies. You saw the passage of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, which comes up a lot. We're hearing a lot of discussions about that today, but that basically set the rules for how you conduct foreign intelligence. And, before then, so this established a very clear framework for doing it for national security purposes within the United States, just to be precise. It created the FISA courts. You also saw the creation of select intelligence oversight committees in the Senate and House, so that Congress could basically keep an eye on what it was that the executive branch was doing. And this is because of the revelations of widespread abuses by intelligence agencies, including extensive domestic surveillance by the FBI and the CIA. This came out through the Church Committee. And then you had the War Powers Act. We sort of haven't even gotten to this, but Vietnam was obviously an incredibly important issue. Concerns around the president's behavior, sort of the actions that he took. And in this case, this is sort of a direct response to the expanded military operations in Cambodia, the secret military operations in Cambodia. And when that came to light, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which was intended to reassert the role that Congress plays in initiating hostilities with foreign countries. So some pretty major changes in these areas.
Yeah, very significant. It seems that one of the reasons you wrote the report is kind of to remind the American people of this history. Do you feel it's been forgotten?
Well, I think, everyone obviously remembers Watergate, and it seems like every year or two someone tries to stick date on another scandal to get people to focus on it. But I think that people have lost sight of just how widespread and important the reforms post-Watergate have been. So we didn't even get to this, but of course, you had a complete revamping of the congressional budget process that occurred as well because of abuses by Nixon. You had the National Emergencies Act, which deals with the manner in which the president can declare national emergencies and therefore be able to take extraordinary actions pursuant to various statutes. Just a wide range of reforms. And the reason it's important is because when you see these parallels and you see the sorts of holes in our system that are being revealed by the widespread corruption from the Trump administration, it's good to know that we went through this before, and what we need to be ready, and we need to basically learn those lessons, be ready to have a similarly broad response that we should focus not just on a few narrow issues, but understand that this is widespread corruption, which therefore requires an equally broad response.
Mm-hmm. And Sam, obviously, we don't know when or how this current administration will end, but you argue that we need to be prepared and not wait until it's over. What do you want to see happen?
I think what's critical is that folks start thinking now about what are the holes in our system that have been revealed, and not just specific instances in which Trump has been corrupt here or there, but the sort of deeper-seated problems. What's allowed this to happen? What's allowed, for example, this sort of foreign influence operation? Why have we seen the kind of corruption connected with corporations and the wealthy being able to dump tons of money into our political system? And recognize that there are deep structural problems that Trump didn't necessarily create, but has revealed. And in revealing them, it provides an opportunity to address them. But we're not going to do it if people don't start thinking big and start thinking big now. Trying to figure out how these things all connect. What are the real issues that have been revealed, and what it is that we need to do to address them? I think there's a tendency for folks to get caught up in the moment, and I think it is, of course, of critical importance to people that are opposing some of the disastrous policies that we see coming out of this administration every day. That's critical work. Folks that are out there right now knocking on doors, making calls, that sort of thing. Incredibly important work. For policymakers, it's important that they begin thinking now how to fix some of these problems, because the worst thing that happened would be, we said, at the end of this administration, people just say, okay, well, that was sort of an anomaly, move on, and then we find ourselves back here, with another demagoguing president, corrupt demagoguing president, making the exact same mistakes. And so there's going to be a moment, and to properly seize it, people need to start preparing now.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I want to talk to you about several events currently in the news. The first is the potential appointment of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court and serious concerns that he will not act to hold a president fully accountable to the rule of law. Do you share those concerns?
Yeah, I think we've seen a president who's been very clear about how he views the role of the Justice Department, the justice system itself, which is a tool that he can use to punish those he doesn't like and help those that he does. And so the question becomes, Brett Kavanaugh has pretty extreme views on with respect to the ability of a president to interfere in an investigation, the questions about the president's use of the pardon power in order to obstruct justice or put himself above the law, the role that the executive branch can play in investigating the president, and whether or not the president has to comply with aspects of the judicial process, legal processes like subpoenas and the like. One of the things that I've been concerned about is that we haven't heard a strong declaration from the nominee about the fact that the president isn't above the isn't above the law. Rather, he sort of said those exact words, but when pushed on particulars, which is really where it matters, he's demurred. Say, I can't talk about that, or it's not appropriate. And given the unique situation we're in which a president who himself has been accused of being a co-conspirator in a felony by his own lawyer, simultaneously is the subject of a multi-person investigation into whether or not he conspired with a foreign adversary to undermine our elections. The notion that he's now appointing a judge who can rule on cases that directly result and implicate those investigations, and that judge, or who would then be justice if confirmed, refuses to recuse himself and refuses to basically make clear that he would actually hold the president accountable and make sure that he's not above the law. It's extremely concerning.
Mm-hmm. Borderline scary. Lastly, I want to ask you about recent revelations in Bob Woodward's book and in an anonymous op-ed in the New York Times that suggests there is a group of senior administration officials actively intervening to prevent the president from taking actions that would harm the nation. You've worked in government as a senior policy advisor at the White House Domestic Policy Council and in senior positions at OMB. Could you have ever imagined anything like the scenario that we're now hearing about.
I mean, it's incredible. So, one of the stories, taking something off the president's desk. One of my roles at the Office of Management and Budget was clearing every executive order and presidential memorandum before it went to the president. So it would go through a process at OMB, and then it would go to the staff secretary who would run the final process within the White House, and then it would go to the president for signature. And the reason we spent all this time, had all this input, had this elaborate process is that once something goes to the president, that's it. I mean, you can always, of course, in our case, go to him and say, we need to take this back. We made a mistake. But that's something, that's basically the worst day of your life if you have to do this. The notion that you would have senior advisors just taking things off the desk in order to influence policy, it's terrifying. But I think what's equally terrifying is that you have a president that's putting people in that position, namely that's putting forward policies and ideas, if we can call them ideas, irritable mental gestures, that force people of his own party that he's appointed to feel like they need to intervene on behalf of the American people. It's a terrifying situation, and I think it reveals a deep rot in the current Republican Party, a deep rot that allowed this man to become the nominee, to become president, and that has caused so many people in the administration to refuse to stand up and say something. The right thing to do is to resign, right? Is to resign and tell the American people what you're witnessing and the concerns that you have. There may be certain people in very particular national security positions who feel like they must stay in order to prevent truly catastrophic issues, and I think that there's a good point to be made there. But for the vast majority of folks, if you don't like what you're seeing, and you shouldn't, if you're upset about somebody that is siding with white supremacists, that's advancing an incredibly racist set of policies towards immigrants, and it's encouraging people to view the media as the enemy of the people, and you should be. I mean, there's an attack on core American values. You should resign. You should tell the American people what you're seeing. You should make it clear this man is unfit. I think that writing an anonymous op-ed isn't really the way to go about doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it is scary, and what I don't understand are the people that are just members of Congress and in the Senate that don't stand up when they have to know better, and that scares me a lot.
Sure, I mean it's an open secret. There's no confusion. It's not you don't ever hear anybody in Congress say, "Oh, that's not the Donald Trump that I know and love." They recognize that he's unstable. That he knows very little about policy, that he makes rash judgments that threaten to undermine America's standing in the world. But they're just more concerned about helping out their donors and getting their judges appointed than actually standing up for this country. And it's incredibly disappointing to see.
It is.
I think it's the thing that, if someone had said that we would be in this place 2 or 3 years ago, if you'd suggested that the Republican Party, or to be clear, elected members of the Republican Party would capitulate this much to someone who's acting so contrary to American values, I think rightly people would say, I don't believe it. There would be a limit. There's no way that they would go this far. But here we stand, and I think what's even more concerning is we don't even seem to be hitting the end point. I think a lot of us, I think a lot of the American people, are concerned that there's really no length that this president could go to that would cause Republican members of Congress to stand up to him. And I think that's why you're seeing such an outpouring of support for a Democratic Congress to have a check on this president, some means within the federal system, the federal government, to oppose what we all see as a dangerous president who's undermining values that are core to this country.
Midterms aren't far away, folks. Please get out and vote. Sam Berger, senior advisor at the Center for American Progress, where he recently posted a report and was on with us to talk about it, co-authored with Alex Tosanovich, titled Lessons from Watergate, Preparing for Post-Trump Reforms. Sam, thank you so much for your time today on America's Democrats podcast. We look forward to hearing back from you again soon.
Thanks so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure,
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, can a movement to elect the president by who wins the most popular votes actually succeed? We'll find out in just a moment. First, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
It's practically unanimous. 9 out of 10 establishment economists agree that America's solid job growth and low unemployment rate truly make ours the land of opportunity. So why, they wonder aloud, is the state of labor today so morose? Well, start with all those jobs. Quantity is one thing, but quality is what really matters. As Jesse Jackson has pointed out, even slaves had jobs. While not in slavery, millions of Americans today, from Walmart employees to school teachers, are paid so little that they have to patch together 2 or 3 jobs each to eke out a bare-bones living. In fact, major corporations have made poverty pay central to their profit strategy, with giants like Amazon, McDonald's, and Walmart issuing such puny paychecks that their workers have to rely on food stamps and other public programs to make ends meet. That's a corporate subsidy of roughly $150 billion a year taken from us taxpayers. Miserly pay, however, is only one cause of the stunning fact that more than half of American workers now say that they're looking to leave their current jobs. The deeper issue is the overall lack of respect for workaday people. After all, workers can see in their daily job experiences that the powers that be, from corporate chieftains to political leaders, consider employees to be a cost to be cut, not an asset to advance. Working stiffs see the continued offshoring of their jobs and deliberate decimation of their rights and union bargaining power. They see leaders of both political parties go whoring for corporate dollars while rigging the rules to gut everything from overtime pay to health care. And they see the power elite rushing to a robot economy that will leave them and their children out in the cold. This is Jim Hightower saying it's not just labor that's under attack, it's the middle class. More than a Labor Day, America needs an all-out labor rebellion.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Karen Hobert Flynn leads one of the nation's leading organizations dedicated to strengthening democracy. That's why she says it's time for the nation to change the way we elect our president. And we say hello to Karen Hobert Flynn, who's the president of Common Cause, one of several organizations supporting the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. So let's start with the basics. What is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact?
So first, I should say that the current system has the candidate. We would expect the candidate with the most popular votes to be elected president, just like every other election. But unfortunately, that is not the way our system works. Electing the president is not done that way. The current system uses the Electoral College, where electors select who's going to be president. And the challenge is that states are given the authority of how they allocate those votes. Most states, 48 states, allocate those based on a winner-take-all strategy of who wins the popular vote in that state. What happens is that we don't have the winner of the popular vote across the country electing the president. And so what happens as a result of that is we see candidates really just focusing most of their time and energy campaigning in states where they're battleground states that can make a big difference. And so we have had in our history 5 different times when the candidate who placed second in the popular vote elected as president. Once in 2016, so that was just very recently, in 2000, in 1888, 1876, and 1824. And so 5 of the last 12 presidential elections, we could see also if we shifted a handful of votes in 1 or 2 states, we could have also elected the second place candidate. And so it disenfranchises voters in more than 2/3 of the states who don't live in these battleground states. Mm-hmm. The presidential candidates don't really have reason to visit or poll or advertise or organize in most states. And so just in 2016 alone, we saw 68% of the campaign visits were in just 6 states. And they 2/3 of, or actually 94% of 2016 events were in 12 states. And so that means in Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia, Michigan, and other battleground states, there's a lot of activity. And most of the other states see no interest from presidential candidates. And in a lot of ways, their votes don't matter in the election of the president. And that isn't really democracy.
And that creates that attitude of my vote doesn't count.
That's right.
There's that part of it.
There is. And, I do think polls show that people believe that the president should be elected by the national popular vote. And there's widespread support of that. But we also see people believe that their votes don't matter. And so 44% of the voting age population didn't vote in the 2016 election. That's a huge portion of our voting age population. And for a democracy, that should not be the way our elections are run.
Absolutely. In a piece that you wrote for the Daily Beast back in 2016, you stated that the National Popular Vote Compact is in keeping with the spirit of our nation's charter, in other words, our Constitution. What did you mean by that?
When we look at even the preamble of the Constitution, we talk about we the people of the United States established the Constitution for the United States of America. And our Constitution rests on the idea of popular sovereignty, that a government in which the people's voice and the people rule. And when we have a system to elect our president that ignores such a huge portion of our population, it's a real problem. NPR did an analysis in 2016, and they found that it's possible to win the Electoral College with just 23% of the popular vote using the Electoral College. That is an incredibly small portion of the population. And it means that for many other states, 38 states are flyby states. They are states that are ignored. And so that's a real problem for our democracy. And there are ways to fix it. And actually the Interstate Compact, the National Popular Vote Compact, is a way to fix that process. It would
Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead. No, you go ahead.
It would make all votes equal. It would ensure that the candidate with the most votes win the election, just like in other elections that we have in our country, like the elections for governor. It would bring candidates to every state and make them listen to everyone's concerns, not just those that are in battleground states, which tend to be whiter, more rural. It would give voters in all states, regardless of their party affiliation, an incentive to vote in presidential elections, and, frankly, would help get out the vote in all states and in all elections. And I think that it would really rid the nation of these falsely polarized red and blue election night maps that we see, where we're looking at, how presidential candidates are racking up votes in a red or a blue state to get to the 270 votes they need to win the Electoral College.
I was going to mention that on the Common Cause website, there's a detailed list of the problems with our Electoral College. You were touching on some of that just a second ago. What are some of the other more significant problems with the current Electoral College?
One of the things is that it means that that battleground states get most of the attention. We also see the battleground states, you will see, are more likely to get money when there are federal emergencies, that there are more benefits that accrue to their states because both when candidates are campaigning there and once elected, they're more likely to do favors for battleground states. And so, that is not it is not a fair system, and it's one that discounts so many people across the country. It means that not every vote is equal, so that most Americans are completely irrelevant in presidential elections. And so that, I think, is a huge problem. And we also see it can impact how people vote. So young adults in swing states are 30% more likely to vote than young people in the rest of the nation. And so it has a real impact on how people participate. So one of the positive things about this is something that we can fix without amending the Constitution. We can use a national popular vote contract, an interstate compact, where states come together and say that they will award their electors to the winner of the national popular vote. And so what that means is that they each pass a state law that enables them to enter into a legally enforceable contractual obligation to allocate their electoral votes to the winners of the national popular vote. And once we get to enough states passing this interstate compact through their legislature and signed by the governor in their state, then when we get to enough states for 270 electoral votes, those votes will be allocated to the winner of the national popular vote, thereby ensuring that we have a national popular vote winner. And so it doesn't abolish the Electoral College. You don't have to amend the Constitution. You just do this compact. And so we've seen 12 states in the District of Columbia pass this interstate compact over the last number of years. So they have 172 electoral votes committed to this national popular vote compact, and they just need 98 more electoral votes for this to become this interstate compact to be in operation. So that is very exciting, and we've seen bipartisan support moving these kinds of reforms. In fact,
that is so impressive.
It is. Just a few months ago, Connecticut was the latest state to pass the National Popular Vote Compact.
There are, of course, many myths about the national popular vote. One is that smaller states will lose their vote. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's interesting because the popular elections would give small states a bigger voice. So if you look at the smallest states, 12 of the 13 smallest states in the country are actually sidelined in presidential elections as they currently stand because they're not competitive. So Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Alaska, they usually vote Republican, and then Rhode Island, Delaware, Maine, Vermont, Hawaii, and D.C. usually vote Democratic. And so what happens is these are never battleground states, and we don't see presidential candidates going there. And if you took all of those states and the District of Columbia, you would have about 11 million people and 40 electoral votes. And Ohio, which is a battleground state, has about 11 million people also and only 20 electoral votes. But the people in Ohio have significantly more impact because that is a battleground state where presidential candidates spend millions of dollars campaigning. And so they just have much more influence. So if we were to move to national popular vote compact, these smaller states, their votes would matter. And so I think that's really important. And even if you look in large states like Florida, for example, or in Ohio, when presidential candidates go to those states, they travel all over the state. So they're not just going to big cities or a few urban centers. They also go in small, medium, and large towns. So they campaign all over the state. And so if we were to open up the system by passing a national popular vote compact, we would have candidates traveling all over the country because they want to get as many votes as they can of the national popular vote because that's what's going to determine whether they win or not.
Mm-hmm. You know, and it's not like they don't have enough time because we start the process for running for offices now soon after an election occurs, and so we're on to the next election. So they got plenty of time to visit all these different states. Well, another myth is that a national popular vote is an anti-Republican idea. True or not true?
That's not true. It's not true at all. And in fact, we see support for national popular vote and bipartisan support for national popular vote in many of the states that are engaged. In fact, in September, there have been bills introduced, companion bills in the House and Senate in Michigan. And the 25 senators in the state Senate include 15 Republicans and 10 Democrats, and they're supporting national popular vote. Some Republicans believe that our current system benefits Democratic presidents over Republicans. And so that is one of the reasons that they look at it. Many others want to see, people from all across the country and small states and large states that are not battleground states to have their voices heard. So we have seen support for this, across the aisle. I will say that recent elections can sometimes have an impact. So when George W. Bush won in 2000, he lost the popular vote but won the electoral vote. Support for an idea like national popular vote dipped a little. And then as you moved further away from the election, people looked at the actual reform itself and thought less about the election that they had just participated in and saw the real benefits of a national popular vote. And likewise, in 2016, when Donald Trump did the same thing, there was a dip in Republican support shortly after that, but we are starting to see, once again, Republicans and Democrats moving these national popular vote bills in states across the country.
I mean, it is supposed to be about what the people want, and the president and everybody else that's in offices. I mean, you're representing those people, so you should be listening to those people. And gosh, a national popular vote would certainly take care of that. But of course, right. We're not done talking about myths. Perhaps the most pervasive myth is that a national popular vote goes against the Constitution. That can't be true.
It is not true. And in fact, the Constitution squarely says that it is up to the states to decide how to allocate their electors. So this is clearly defined in the Constitution as belonging to the states. And so states at any time can change how they allocate their electors' votes. So we don't have to amend the Constitution. You don't need to abolish the Electoral College. Doing an interstate compact, and there are hundreds of interstate compacts, is a way to fix this problem without having to change the Constitution in any way.
We're speaking with Karen Hobert Flynn, who's the president of Common Cause, and talking today about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Karen, where is the greatest resistance to a national popular vote?
You know, there are some groups on the right that have opposed National Popular Vote Compact, and probably one of the best examples is the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. ALEC has been a secretive collaboration between businesses and conservative politicians where they come together and behind closed doors ghostwrite model bills that they introduce in state capitals across the country. And so their agenda is often pro-business, anti-environmental, and actually anti-reform. So they used to have a segment, a committee that focused on putting up barriers to people being able to vote. So, battling online voter registration and automatic voter registration and other reforms that would give people more access to be able to have their voices heard in elections. And so they have an anti-reform agenda, and one of those things was opposing a national popular vote. In some ways, I think that they are less interested in the people's voice in our democracy and more interested in how the wealthy and corporate interest can get more of what they want passed, whether it's gutting minimum wage or getting loopholes for big industries and the super rich. And so I would say that is probably the most powerful and challenging opposition that we faced on this measure.
Your effort is the result of a coalition of organizations calling for the end of the Electoral College. Who are some of the members of this coalition?
It's a terrific coalition, and I would first say National Popular Vote, and if you went to nationalpopularvote.com, you can see it was one of the founding organizations that conceived of this interstate compact, and there's lots of great information, and they track what's happening in states. We also work with Fair Vote, AARP, groups like the Sierra Club, the NAACP, many labor organizations, the Democracy Initiative. There are new groups coming into this issue, too, a new group called Make Every Vote Count. Lots of activists from Indivisible and other groups that are really interested in engaging in these issues as well.
Now, this is hardly the first time Americans have questioned the validity of the Electoral College, and certainly in those two recent elections in 2016 and 2000, it was discussed. What gives you hope that now is the time when change is actually within reach?
What gives me hope is that I have seen more people engaging at this moment in history in issues around democratic structural issues because of the huge challenges we've seen with the 2016 election and the Trump administration challenging our democratic norms and values and institutions. Many people came out to resist and fight back against that. But also, they have wanted to engage in passing reforms that give people stronger voice in their democracy. And so National Popular Vote has been one of those issues where people that have never been involved before are coming out of the woodwork saying, this is something we need. This is something that needs to pass. And that's what gives me hope. I have never seen this kind of activism, and I've been doing this work for more than 30 years, this kind of activism around democracy, and it's inspiring.
Before we let you go, on the Common Cause website, visitors are asked to sign a letter to their state lawmakers. Tell us what the letter says, and how can listeners find it?
So the letter talks about contacting your member of Congress to say, and your state legislators, and to say, we want you to pass a national popular vote compact. And to link to the letter, you just need to go to www.commoncause.org/NPV, which stands for National Popular Vote. And if you do that, you can sign into the letter and send it to your state legislators. And we hope that you will engage in this very important fight. There are opportunities to move this in a number of state legislatures, and we will be fighting in many states come 2019. Places like Oregon and Delaware, New Mexico, Nebraska, Michigan, Arizona, and many other states. So we hope you'll join us in this fight.
And again, folks, I encourage you to go to commoncause.org/NPV for National Popular Vote to get more information, to get in touch with your state senators and congressmen, and we really need to make this happen. It's long overdue. Karen Hobert Flynn, president of Common Cause, joining us today to talk about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Karen, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it, and we look forward to having you back again soon with a positive update, I hope.
Oh, great. I'd love to do that. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Eric Dean, president of the International Association of Bridge, Structural, Ornamental, and Reinforcing Ironworkers.
We are so pleased to welcome to the studio one of the leaders of America's labor movement today. We honor all American workers, union members and non-union members, but particularly those union members, and one of our great union leaders today, President Eric Dean of the Ironworkers Union. Mr. President, it's great to see you.
How are you, Bill?
Happy Labor Day.
Happy Labor Day to all the listeners.
And we appreciate very much the support of the ironworkers for our program. And we often, when we talk about that, we say the ironworkers who are building America's communities today and ready to rebuild America's infrastructure tomorrow. That's still the mission, right?
Ready.
Yeah, you're at it. So first, let's talk a little bit about the state of the labor movement today. I checked this morning, as of 2017, last year, the level of union membership in this country across the board, private and public, 10.7%. It was double that maybe 20 years ago.
No doubt. Yeah.
What's happened?
We've had a historic trend line downward. The labor movement had, for our organization, 1980 was our high water mark. The laws, maybe we rested on our laurels, a combination of complacency, but there's definitely a concerted effort in controlling judicial issues that affect our ability to bargain. And we maybe lost our way, at least in my union, as far as the ability to organize. We relied solely on an apprenticeship training program method, which is tried and true, and we were very proud of it. But to resupply the workforce, we kind of abandoned talking to workers and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And then the laws really restrict our ability. They locked up workplaces, and they until the Obama administration's expedited NLRB ruling, where you could call for faster card check elections, we saw this delay and stall tactic that happened. And what would happen is oftentimes you'd hire a union-busting attorney in any organizing campaign. They'd play out the clock, and they'd bargain with you, and they'd check the box and say, we met. And oftentimes it came to no resolve, and the workers didn't feel power.
Yeah.
In the last 2 years, I don't know if it's uniting against the current political environment or whatnot. You've seen teachers that couldn't bargain revolt en masse. You've seen different things, and we're enjoying some success in our organizing ability. We're seeing workers want to be represented and have collective bargaining.
Is part of the problem that a lot of younger workers today don't realize that the benefits that they enjoy in terms of salary or safe working conditions or health care or vacation time and everything, that didn't come easy. It just didn't. It's not like picking an apple off the tree, right? They don't realize that the unions are the ones that went out there and fought and delivered those. And now they they want them all, but they don't want to join the union.
We took for granted, I think, as a society. I talked to neighbors, folks in my community, and you say, well, we don't need unions today because, like, employers are fair. They don't realize the hard-fought gains that were fought for and gained. And
would be taken away if
we joke a little bit about our entry-level members, even in our union, that they take some spatial aptitude tests. They get selected for an apprenticeship. They put a sticker on their hat, and they think that instantly makes them a trade unionist. And they don't realize all that was fought for by the union movement, not only for the union members, but for everyone underneath. That we floated and got major labor law reform across the board for the benefit of all working men and women.
So you alluded to this a little bit, but are there efforts today to really go out and organize and bring in new members and say, look, this is what the stakes are, and this is why it's important to be a member of this union? Do you see any turnaround at all? I
do. I believe, I sit on the AFL Executive Council, so I see my brothers and sisters in the entire labor movement really putting an emphasis on organizing, talking to workers, and building campaigns around fairness in the workplace. And you're seeing the downturn in the post-08 economy, I think, awaken people to the fear that without collective bargaining, without collective action, you don't really have the opportunity. And then in the building and construction trades, we lost market share across the board. And we're recognizing the fact that we need to talk to workers, organize the employers, in addition to our state-of-the-art apprenticeship training.
What about the particularly in the construction industry, the contractors that you work with, the developers, the people who put up the money for the building, then they hire workers to build that structure? Are they ever on your side, I guess? Do you ever make common cause with them? It seems to me that they would want the most skilled workforce that they can really depend on.
One of the most unique things that my union does, it's not unique to my union, but within our sector of the ironworking industry, is we have a labor management program, and we are at one. We are stakeholders in the industry. Our signatory contractors are our best partners. They risk their capital. They secure work. But
these are the builders and the developers, right?
That's correct. Yeah. Some of the builders and developers are looking for cheap, and they exploit labor and whatnot. So, you play into the current administration's rationale about illegal immigrants and whatnot. One of our biggest challenges is when we want to go talk to workers. If there's undocumented workers in the workforce, we want those people to get fairly compensated for the work they do, irregardless of their skin color, their language, or whatnot. And oftentimes the laws kind of hamper us from bringing them out of the darkness because there's this whole culture. And I think there are some low-road contractors and low-road developers who want to exploit the undocumented worker. And, we're trying to we have a whole nother topic. I don't want to take you off of Labor Day. The president currently has got a jihad against TPS, temporary protected status.
Yes, I noticed that.
I can't tell you how many members are in my union that are here legally from some reason where they left their country, and they are legally documented workers, and they're getting the rugs pulled out from underneath them. I thought they were talking about this whole underground economy, but instead they're going after legally protected workers. But that's topic, probably.
No. That's absolutely right on point. In fact, I have a new book coming out next month, Trump Must Go, the top 100 reasons to dump Trump. And one of the things I talk about is this temporary protected status program, where these are people who came here either because of some natural disaster like earthquake or volcanic eruptions or hurricanes or whatever, or from
Civil
War, like in El Salvador,
yeah.
right? And they're here, and they've from many, many different countries. They do have, under this TPS program, legal status. They may not be citizens, but they're here, legal status. And Donald Trump has pulled the rug out from under all of those, whether it's El Salvador or I forget Haiti, other countries, and just said, "Oh no, we're going to end that program. Y'all got to go back."
President Obama, through his executive order, shined a light on DACA. So that rolls off the tongue. All Americans know about the DACA, the
Dreamers
Deferred
program.
Action. Yeah, the Dreamers. We have members that are working under that, which had temporary legal status based on the president's executive order. Current administration is looking to undo that. Very few people even know about the TPS program. They're vested members in our union. They have pensions. They have health care.
They are union
solid
members.
Citizens.
Undocumented workers can belong to a union.
They're actually legally documented TPS.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And you know what? Truth be told, it's the employer's responsibility for I-9 verification. Mm-hmm. The union is seeking fairness in the workplace, and we're trying to stop some of this exploitation by the low road developers and contractors. But our fair ones, there's a difference between the people who employ our members. They want them to be compensated. They want a good pool of benefits so that they stay in the workforce and they stay around. They may not employ them 52 weeks out of the year. They may share them with their other peers. That's the beauty of the way our multi-employer construction trade goes is they share employees. They send them back to the union hall, and then they get one or the same employee back. And that's the beauty of the construction industry. We've had some friends who talk about jobs, and they say that certain jobs are temporary jobs. The career is permanent. It's the construction site. We go from construction site and employer to employer.
But that's the nature of construction, right?
Yeah. Well, we get offended when people refer to us as temporary. I told a good friend of mine who made that mistake of saying that, and I'll leave his name out because I view him favorably. And he's from my home state, and I told him my son is 30 temporary jobs away from retirement because he sought a career in construction. So don't minimize one project as a temporary
Well, it
job.
sort of makes sense when you think about it. You're building a building, and the building is finished. And
Comes to the end, you move on.
Yeah.
And you either stay with the employer and go to his next building, or you go back to the union hall, and then you go to work for a like-minded employer.
Right. So maybe we should start here, but I just want to be sure that all of our viewers and our listeners understand iron workers, right? What's the essence of as part of building a building, right? Construction industry, what's the role of the iron workers?
So I'm going to do what I hate doing is I'm going to refer to the common mistake people make. People call us steel workers. Steel workers produce steel in steel mills, aluminum mills, and that type of stuff.
Yeah, right.
The iron worker is the construction trade that builds skyscrapers. We use structural steel. We build with rebar. We do the aluminum and stainless steel glass cladding with the glazing contractors, and we build building facades, highways, bridges, major industrial facilities.
Right.
And so we are a construction trade, but we also have an arm that fabricates the components that we assemble on the job site. And so then we have shop iron workers who work in a plant, and they take raw steel beams and they turn them into girders. They put the holes in and they weld the brackets on, or they make stairs out of plate and they turn them, or they make handrail out of pipe. And so I represent both fabricating ironworkers and construction ironworkers. And then within the ironworking, we got structural, reinforcing, architectural and ornamental, and machinery moving and rigging. We do heavy lifts with major industrial cranes and components. And
but stuff. I met with the tallest building now in New York, I guess it is. It took the
World Trade Center. Yes,
right. That took the place of the two World Trade Center towers. When that big high rise was finished. It was the iron workers, right?
There's no doubt, from the antenna to the building facade on the outside to the concrete, the rebar inside the concrete, and all the structural steel that made up that building.
Yeah. Now, as a union member myself, proud union member for 30-some years, one of the things that I found most exciting this year were the teachers that went out there in like Oklahoma, right, in Arizona, not just in blue states, in red states. And they stopped the clock, and they were able to bring about some real changes. That shows a lot of excitement, and
it's invigorated us across the labor movement. Whether you're a
not just
construction
limited
trade,
to teachers, right?
But I mean, the entire labor movement is empowered by the collective action of those folks facing against and being an industry stakeholder and educating. Full disclosure, I have two daughters who are National Education Association members, and they felt empowered by the collective action. They're fortunate enough to teach in Illinois under a fair collective bargaining agreement, but when they see teachers' rights stripped in other states, it empowers everyone who's a part of that and who's around or in that industry. So.
Right. And the other big movement that we've seen in terms of labor activity and getting more people involved was the $15 minimum wage, particularly around the fast food industry, where I think was particularly maybe the SEIU, Mary Kay Henry, who led that fight. But again, that's the fight that sort of empowered the entire labor movement.
We wanted to put a floor under a base wage of what a worker gets so that there's some dignity in their work. And I can't think of anyone who couldn't think that that's not a sustainable or fair wage. Unfortunately, there's a subservient to Wall Street and the stock prices versus the workers. The workers make the wealth. The capitalists risk their capital, but the workers take that risk of capital and they create the wealth. They're more worried about stockholders than they are oftentimes the people who generate the profits through productivity.
But
and
I mean, even at $15 a minimum wage, that's hardly a living wage.
Oh no, that's a floor for a base. That's what we want it to be. 'Cause those people are going to dispose of that income. They're going to get in their pocket. We live in a consumption economy. I hate to get all wonky. I'm just a construction guy. But you put money in working people's pocket, they spend that money, and the economy prospers as a result of it. So.
Sure, yeah. And we've seen that. And you give the big tax cuts to the wealthiest people who don't need a tax cut, right? And what do they do with it? They'll just squirrel it away somewhere, right? It's not going out into the economy.
We were frustrated by the tax policy. Not that it wasn't necessary. Haven't even walked a fine line between people who were against and for repatriation. We thought and we're kind of half promised that there might be some debt service vehicle by the repatriated money, creating an infrastructure bank to use that money and then give them discounted tax breaks on the way back. We didn't realize it was going to just go back into share buybacks, and
which is what's done. So what happened to infrastructure? I mean, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders both ran in the primary, and then Donald Trump in the general. Infrastructure, $1 trillion, right? Infrastructure. First thing I'm going to do, we're going to rebuild America's bridges and highways and water systems across the board. I haven't heard anybody talk about infrastructure for a year.
It was
certainly not Donald Trump.
The administration's priorities and the failure to take up infrastructure first, I think, was a very strategic misstep.
If Donald Trump had, he would have had bipartisan support, right?
There's no doubt. America's bridges aren't owned by capitalists or labor. Working men and women drive. It's not just because I build roads and bridges. My kids drive on them when they drive to their jobs. Goods get to market through infrastructure, rail, air transportation, water. Yeah, every healthy society relies on a strong infrastructure, not an outdated or decaying one. And so everyone running for president, everyone, I said it on the AFL, I think we interviewed 5 candidates for presidency. Everyone had an infrastructure component. The problem is how do you pay for it? And, so as much as the president promised, I think Congress got to get off their butt and they got to find a way to have sustainable funding and pay for even if it's at the risk of incurring debt, because it betters society as a whole. I have a cabin in the North Woods. They build an overpass and an interchange there. 4 years later, there's businesses at every intersection. Everyone benefits by that. The citizens who commute can get on the highway and get to work faster. But the problem is not only new infrastructure it's the existing stuff that we have that we're not really maintaining, and that's what's getting that low grade. And the longer it decays, it becomes costlier to replace things than it is to repair them on an ongoing manner.
It was just a couple of weeks ago that we saw this bridge in Genoa, Italy, collapse. There are bridges not to put the fear or try to scare people, but there are bridges in this country that are not in great shape.
Bill, you go back with leaders of my organization for a long period of time. Jake West wrote a white paper on the decay of infrastructure.
Really?
Yeah. Mr. Hunt re-authored that white paper. President Wise, my predecessor, we've talked, we've walked the halls of Congress, and it's something that we're ready to do, but there's no willingness. And I have a little scenario of why I think it's so hard is Congress only thinks in 2-year terms. They just think about their next reelection, and there's only so much they can accomplish. Senators think of 4 or 6 years at a time, and presidents and governors tend to think in 4 or 8 year terms. Infrastructure takes a 10 to 20 year comprehensive long-range plan. You got to have the debt instruments, you got to have the engineering, you got to do the environmental impact studies. And nobody is that long range of a thinker. Everybody's just the squirrel with the nut. They're thinking about, how do I get reelected? So it's easier to patch a pothole than it is to plan for a bridge, a river crossing, or a lock and dam, or whatever,
No, I think your analysis is absolutely right. The idea that a member of Congress could think 12 months ahead, right, let alone 5 years. And it used to be the transportation plan, the transportation bill, that was the one thing you'd have Republicans and Democrats agreeing on. They would pass a 5-year plan at a time. Hell, they can't get a 1-year plan out of Congress these days.
Yeah, they passed the bill in the last administration, and the current administration was kind of disentangling some of the money and then reprioritizing it, and they're proposing private sector funding. As a individual, not a big fan. But if that's the vehicle to get it going, we're going to see if we can't pull our assets together and help take stock in some. But you can't toll every road. You can't toll every flush of a toilet. Every time you turn your faucet on, you're going to have to pay for water to come out of the pipe. There's got to be some level things that society demands that the government provides.
No, just jumping in myself here with it, but the problem with, as this administration seems to be, does certainly prefer and is pushing with private funding for infrastructure, is the people who put up the private money are going to build what they can make money off of. They're not necessarily going to build what the public needs.
Senator Barrasso has said, that's great for the tunnel to New York, but it's not going to help people of Wyoming because there's not enough cash to be made off of tolling any kind of road or bridge that's built out there.
Now, every single member of the Iron Workers Union is great, is a hero, is a hard worker. We love them all. But there's one that we particularly love, and that's a guy named Randy Bryce out in Wisconsin. Iron Stash.
We're excited about his candidacy.
He's been here. He's been in the studio with us, and so tell us about it. He's running for Congress.
He's a rank-and-file iron worker out of Milwaukee, Local 8. That's one of our early founding locals. He's had a career. He was a big activist when the state took away collective bargaining rights, and he was at the center of some of that massive rallies that went on at the state capitol.
When Scott Walker was taking collective bargaining away, right?
So when he declared his candidacy sight unseen, I said, well, that's a big task going against the Speaker of the House. He's got a big war chest.
It's running against Paul Ryan.
But you know what? Ironworkers, we always have each other's back. So for us, I told him, you name the place, where and when you need me. So I've been to Texas with him. I've been up to Milwaukee. We just commemorated the loss of some members who were killed at the Brewers Stadium, and Randy came out to help commemorate his fallen brothers. We've had him up at headquarters, and we're going to put our shoulder to the wheel. We have one member of Congress, Peter Not Peter Lynch, Stephen Lynch. Peter Lynch is the investor.
Yeah.
Stephen Lynch out of Massachusetts is a member of the Ironworkers, and we're looking forward to having our second.
Well, Randy Bryce has already knocked Paul Ryan off, right? He's got Paul Ryan not running for re-election, so I'm sure he's got a Republican opponent there. But I think it's a very exciting race, and he's a great candidate. And
we're excited. And he has warts. Everybody's human. They came out with a hit piece, and he recognized. He said, "I made mistakes," and he said, that was 20 years ago, a different chapter in my life, and moving on. And it's how you handle your warts when you're a candidate. Yeah. When people gloss over him or mislead the public, he's nothing but an honest, hardworking, blue-collar guy, and his voice will be heard strongly.
And he's also caught on nationwide. I think a lot of people know about him, got his message, and are supporting him. And I hope more people continue to do so. Go. That
rollout video was killer good. I said I hope there's a couple more good ones like that because it was really impressive.
Let's hope so, too. So the end of last week, just before Labor Day, he celebrated Labor Day, President Trump did, by putting a freeze on pay raise for federal employees. Thanks a lot, Donald Trump, right? His message was basically, we can't afford it. Now, we know there's a lot of other stuff that he can afford, like $54 billion to the Pentagon, an additional $54 billion, like $1 trillion tax cut, right, for the wealthiest of Americans. Can't afford a pay raise for federal employees. I know you don't represent federal employees, but this is an anti-labor message for Labor Day.
When any administration harms labor, whether it be through right to work or austerity measures, it affects our ability to collectively bargain. In states with right to work, we see oftentimes 12% less compensation in states that don't have right to work.
So it's what they call it. It's the right to work for less money, right?
That's exactly right. So what I'll never get out of any government who wants to get rid of Davis-Bacon, which lowers the wages of construction workers, cut federal workers' wages, they're diminishing their tax base. The very operational income that governments have, if you listen to the righties, what they want to do is slash government and government services and put the burden on everyone else. They provide very meaningful services. They work at the Veterans Administration.
Oh, yeah.
How unpatriotic is it to cut people who work at the VA's wages when we're trying to care for the people who served and fought for this country? So that federal wage cut stuff, it sounds good with the populists. It pits neighbor against neighbor. As a trade unionist, anything that harms a worker, whether it be in my union or another union, we're strongly opposed.
Overall, Donald Trump's record on working men and working families?
Well, he peeled off, as I told you before, he peeled off about 44% of our members on his jobs rhetoric and agenda. But
people now see that he's been in there 2 years, that they still, do you think they would still vote for him?
I think there's a base of people that'll stay with him. We had 40%.
We've seen that.
We've had 40% vote for Mitt Romney, so there's a conservative bent to my business. That being said, we're a Democratic-leaning organization. His words don't match his rhetoric. There are things that he does that we're excited about. Like if they reconstructed a poorly constructed NAFTA, thumbs up, all in favor of it. The problem is you get judicial appointments and NLRB appointments that are gutting our ability to have fair collective bargaining, that are so pro-business and anti-worker, it makes it hard for us to do that. So it's kind of like they got their arm around you and embracing a pro-jobs agenda.
While they're stabbing you in the back, right?
Yeah, there's a stiletto pointed at your organs.
Right.
And so it's a very fine line to walk. We're embracing anything that will foster and create more jobs for American workers, not at the expense of our long-term security and our rights to collectively bargain.
You mentioned the courts, and the biggest, I'm sure, anti-labor decision this year was the United States Supreme Court, the so-called Janus decision, which, again, to me, just created a generation of freeloaders basically saying, yeah, you can get all the benefits of the union, but you don't have to pay your dues, right?
Right.
How does that – now, that was my understanding, public employee unions only, right?
Well,
but
in
not the construction
states where
trade.
that's the law of the land broadly, in the construction thing, because I explained to you, a member knows he's got to go back to the hall. He usually pays dues because he wants to be dispatched to his next job. So we don't have the bleed off per se that the public sector does. But when you go to work at a single employer, a lot of folks, they just think, hey, screw you, I got my job. You got to represent me anyway by this law.
Yeah.
And it's
so why should I pay for it?
It's patently unfair. It's not. There's no good way to describe that freeloading. And then we're also torn between the fact that we want to bargain exclusively rather than leaving them independently. We don't want two pools of wages on those job conditions, so we still want the ability for the employer to recognize and bargain.
Card check. You mentioned this before, but I remember when President Obama was running, the number one priority was card check, card check, card check, which simply made it easier for members to form a union. Have a card, put the check on the card. If enough people do it, majority do it, you got a union.
In the construction industry in Ontario, I represent United States and Canadian workers. That is the law of the land. That's pretty simple.
And it works.
You validate it. You get recognized. You're obligated to bargain.
Yeah.
Some people in the labor movement, I have a different opinion than everyone else. I was in favor of EFCA, the Employee Free Choice Act. The problem is they poison the fact that it wasn't through a secret ballot. If we would have just modified our wishes, I think we could have got that through. The reluctance was, hey, look, they're just going to muscle you into that thing. But I really wish we would have had the Employee Free Choice Act, or at least considered it. Congress didn't. They went for health care and then kind of expended capital.
No, that would have worked. That's a good point. Eric Dean is the president of the Iron Workers Union. It's ironworkers.org. Check out the website, all the good things that they're up to all around the country. Mr. President, on this Labor Day, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic by nature. We're seeing a lot of union halls. We're at real high apprenticeship counts, and so there's a big demand. Our organizing's at full tilt. We are in a full scale, both countries, all areas, with the exception of Western Canada with the oil sands. Everything is pretty strong. We're seeing workers everywhere unite and be empowered and emboldened, and I feel good about it.
Yeah. So thanks for Donald Trump, maybe for getting some real energy and some real passion there among American working families, American working men and women across the board. I'm glad you're optimistic, Mr. President. On that note of optimism, happy Labor Day again.
Thank you, and happy Labor Day to all working men and women.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Sam Berger, Karen Hobert Flynn, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.